The year is 1661. A cold mist coils around the marble pillars of El Escorial Palace in Spain. Inside, the air is heavy, not with celebration but with dread. Courtiers whisper in trembling tones as the queen lies in her bedchamber, laboring through her sixth childbirth. Outside the chamber, priests clutch their rosaries and murmur prayers. When the newborn's first cry echoes through the gilded hall, no one cheers. The royal midwife lowers her eyes. The infant, pale, weak and gasping, looks nothing like a prince destined for glory. His jaw juts forward unnaturally, his tongue swollen. He struggles to breathe. The courtiers pretend not to see. The chronicler dips his quill and writes only one sentence in the royal record. His Majesty has been blessed with a son, but behind those words hides a centuries-old curse, the curse of royal blood itself. For generations, the world's most powerful monarchs believed their blood was sacred, chosen by God to rule. Kings married their cousins. Queens wed their uncles. Siblings shared thrones and beds. They called it divine continuity, a way to keep the crown pure. But what they truly kept alive was decay. Across Europe, this secret ran deeper than any moat. The ancient belief that royal blood must never mix with the commoners became a quiet death sentence passed from one generation to the next. And while the people prayed for heirs, the royal nurseries became crypts of genetic tragedy. In Spain, Austria, France, and even far-off Egypt, rulers wrapped themselves in a lie of perfection. They wore crowns that shimmered with jewels, while their bodies hid deformities so shocking that court painters were ordered to correct the face in every portrait. The House of Habsburg became the most infamous example. They were powerful beyond measure, rulers of empires that stretched from Madrid to Vienna, from Mexico to Milan. But behind the velvet curtains of their courts lay the price of their obsession. Imagine a family tree that folds inward instead of growing outward, branches looping back upon themselves, names repeating for centuries, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, nephew to aunt. Generation after generation the same blood thickened, until it curdled. One historian would later call it the Habsburg trap. Charles II of Spain, the last of his line, was born into this trap. But long before his cursed arrival, signs of degeneration haunted the dynasty. His ancestors had already begun to show strange features: the infamous Habsburg Jaw, the protruding chin that made it hard to eat or speak. Yet they called it a mark of royalty. What others saw as deformity, the royals called destiny. But this story isn't just about one family. It is about an idea, the belief that divine right could define nature. To the kings and queens of the medieval world, the concept of purity of blood was sacred. In Egypt, pharaohs like Tutankhamun were the product of sibling unions, believed to preserve their godlike essence. In Europe, the same idea re-emerged under the Church's blessing. Marriage between royal cousins was seen not as sin, but sanctity. Yet nature is not so forgiving. Behind the golden gates of palaces, midwives whispered of stillborn princes, infants with twisted limbs and babies whose cries never came. Physicians, bound by loyalty, recorded nothing. The people outside the castle walls never knew. They only saw the grandeur, the parades, the portraits, the myths, and so the illusion of divine perfection continued. Even as the blood that fed the throne turned poisonous. By the 1600s, entire royal dynasties across Europe had become webs of intermarriage. The same families ruled different nations: Spain, Austria, France, and all bound by blood and by a slow, invisible doom. In the Habsburg courts, marriage was no longer a union of hearts or even of politics. It was a science of control. To keep the throne from outsiders, they chose brides and grooms from within their own bloodline. Cousin married cousin, aunts wed nephews, and in one case, Emperor Ferdinand I's grandsons were also his great-nephews. The results were catastrophic. Children were born fragile, mentally impaired, and sterile. But in a time when faith ruled over biology, these tragedies were seen not as genetic consequences, but as signs of God's will. Priests called them tests of devotion. Some even whispered that the royal deformities were divine marks of sacrifice. Meanwhile, the physicians, those who knew the truth, dared not speak. To question royal blood was treason, and so the silence deepened. Historians centuries later would find private letters between royal doctors, confessions written in trembling Latin. One described the Spanish prince Don Carlos, who would fly into violent fits, harming himself and others. Another wrote of children with fused spines and water-filled skulls. They were hidden away, declared dead to the world, and still the crowns glittered. Still the masquerade continued. Behind the marble walls of Europe's greatest palaces, the kings of men became prisoners of their own pride. They built dynasties not on strength but on superstition, and their heirs paid the price. As the candlelight flickered over the cradle of a dying infant prince, the priest leaned close and whispered, "May God forgive the sins of kings." But it was not sin that had doomed them. It was their own blood. By the time the 17th century ended, the world had begun to notice the cracks. Murmurs spread through the courts, questions whispered behind fans and goblets. Why were royal children so sick? Why did so many queens fail to bear heirs? The answer, though hidden in silence and secrecy, was already written in their faces, in the long chins, the heavy jaws, the hollow eyes of monarchs who looked more like ghosts than gods. The curse of the bloodline had begun its final descent, and the world would soon witness its most tragic victim, the last Habsburg king, whose very body became the living symbol of a dynasty devoured by its own arrogance. The story of the Habsburgs is not merely one of power and glory. It is a tale of slow decay hidden behind gold and velvet. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the curse of his family's blood had already reached its breaking point. He was the last heir of a dynasty that had ruled Europe for centuries, kings, emperors, and conquerors, yet his very existence symbolized its end. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched king. But his bewitchment was not the work of magic. It was the cost of centuries of royal inbreeding. When the infant Charles was first presented to the court, silence filled the hall. The royal physicians exchanged nervous glances. His head was grotesquely large. His jaw jutted forward so far that he could barely close his mouth. His tongue was swollen, his body frail and thin, his eyes sunken and distant. He struggled to feed, to walk, even to speak. Yet every court chronicler was ordered to write the same lie: the king is in perfect health, blessed by the grace of God. Behind closed doors, however, the truth was terrifying. As he grew older, Charles became a prisoner of his own body. He drooled constantly. He could not chew properly because of the infamous Habsburg Jaw. His teeth were misshapen, and his speech slurred. His mind, too, was slow, clouded by the genetic ruin of generations before him. At just 4 years old, he was declared King of Spain. But in truth, Charles never ruled. The crown that sat upon his head was heavier than any iron shackle. Spain itself mirrored its king's condition. Once the richest empire on earth, stretching across continents, it was now crumbling from within. Gold from the Americas could no longer fill the void of corruption and decay. While Charles sat drooling in his gilded chair, his ministers and priests fought for power behind his back. They whispered that the king was cursed, bewitched by witches or poisoned by his enemies. Desperate for answers, the royal court turned to exorcists and holy relics. One priest, Father Froilan Diaz, claimed that dark forces had entered the king's body. In a chilling ritual, he placed blessed candles around the king's chamber, chanting Latin prayers while courtiers watched in fear. When the candles flickered and died, some swore they saw Charles's eyes roll back, as if something inside him was resisting. It wasn't a demon, though it was his blood. The Habsburg family tree had twisted so tightly that Charles's parents were not only uncle and niece, they shared more ancestors than most cousins. Scientists today estimate that Charles II had the genetic equivalent of being born to parents who were brother and sister twice over. His inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of any European royal before him, or since. His ancestors had been told that marrying within the bloodline preserved the divine right of kings. But instead, it destroyed the very vessel of that divinity. Letters written by the royal physicians, hidden for centuries, describe a man who was short, weak, and unable to sire an heir. He suffered from constant fevers, seizures, and depression. When he tried to marry, both of his wives, Marie-Louise of Orléans and later Maria Anna of Neuburg, found him incapable of consummating the union. He was the King of Spain, yet he could not eat without help, walk without assistance, or rule without being manipulated. The empire's fate was sealed by the very blood it had sworn to protect, and yet through it all Charles remained a tragic figure, pitied, not hated. Those who served him wrote that he was kind, gentle, even childlike. In one letter, a courtier wrote, "His Majesty loves music and birds, but the effort of thought exhausts him." Behind the mask of divine kingship, Charles II was simply a man born to suffer, but the Church saw his weakness as a divine mystery. Priests performed exorcisms to cure him. Doctors applied leeches and purging tonics. Alchemists promised potions to strengthen his blood. Nothing worked. Every year the king grew weaker, and with him, Spain slipped further into decline. In 1700, as the candles in the royal palace burned low, Charles II's body began to fail completely. His skin turned ashen, his hair fell out in clumps, and he was tormented by hallucinations. Witnesses claimed he saw ghosts at night, the spirits of his dead ancestors watching him from the shadows. On his deathbed, Charles whispered to his confessor, "I fear what I am." When he finally died on November 1st, 1700, the court prepared to bury him with royal honors. But what happened next shocked even the hardened priests who had served him. During the autopsy, the surgeons reported horrifying findings. His body was so emaciated that his heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded, his intestines rotten, and his head, abnormally large, was filled with fluid. One witness later said, "It was as if the king had never been truly alive." The Habsburg bloodline in Spain died with him that night, but his death was not the end. It was the final warning. Across Europe, royal courts trembled. The myth of divine blood had been shattered. The same curse that destroyed Charles's body now threatened to ignite wars. France, Austria, and Britain soon plunged into a conflict that would become known as the War of the Spanish Succession, all because one family had refused to mix their blood with the world beyond their walls. Charles' portrait still hangs in Madrid, his jaw deformed, his eyes glassy and lifeless. Many artists refused to paint him truthfully, afraid to offend the crown. But those who did captured something haunting, not just a face but a symbol of what happens when pride defies nature. The last of the Habsburg kings became more than a man. He became a warning from history, a reminder that the pursuit of purity often leads only to rot. And behind his tomb's sealed doors, his story would continue to whisper through time, the echo of a dynasty that tried to play God and lost everything. Royalty has always been obsessed with purity, not of soul but of blood. Behind every glittering crown and silk-draped throne was a secret fear, the fear of impurity. Kings believed their right to rule came from divine veins, blood chosen by God and therefore untouchable. But this obsession led Europe down a dark and twisted path. Marriages were no longer about love or even alliance. They became experiments in control. The same surnames echoed through every palace corridor: Habsburg, Bourbon, Tudor. Cousins became husbands. Nieces became wives. Entire dynasties turned inward, looping into themselves until their blood grew as stagnant as the air in their candlelit chambers. And so began one of the strangest and most forbidden traditions in royal Europe, marrying one's own blood to preserve divine lineage. The roots of this practice stretched deep into medieval paranoia. To the kings of old, mixing royal blood with that of commoners was blasphemy, a dilution of the sacred. "Better to marry your kin," one French courtier once said, "than to share a bed with the unblessed." The Church, initially horrified, soon bent to royal will. Papal dispensations were issued like whispered blessings, allowing incestuous unions to continue under the veil of holiness. Behind stained glass windows, bishops signed the approvals that doomed generations to deformity. The logic was simple and deadly. By marrying within the family, rulers could prevent rival claims to the throne. But what they could not prevent was nature itself. Take the Habsburgs of Austria, the architects of Europe's royal blood web. By the 1500s, their empire spanned from Spain to the Holy Roman lands. But their family tree, it looked more like a circle. Emperor Maximilian. I encouraged his descendants to marry within the dynasty, a decision that would reverberate for centuries. His great-grandson, Philip II of Spain, married his own niece. His son, Philip III, continued the pattern. And so, with every wedding bell, the royal DNA grew weaker, and the faces more distorted. Their portraits tell the story better than any historian could. Elongated jaws, drooping lips, pale, lifeless eyes. The Habsburg Jaw became the dynasty's most recognizable feature. It was as if God himself had carved their punishment into their faces. By the time Charles II, the bewitched king, was born, his family's genetic pool was so corrupted that he could barely function as a human being. He was the living proof of what happens when power defies biology. But the Habsburgs were not alone. The practice infected almost every major royal house in Europe. In Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty, long before Europe's downfall, Cleopatra VII had already set a precedent. She and her brother-husband Ptolemy XIII ruled together, claiming descent from gods. But even among divine blood, jealousy and madness thrived. Their union ended in betrayal and bloodshed, a cycle that would repeat through time. Fast forward to the Tudors of England, and the pattern was reborn under new names. Marriages were tools or weapons forged in silk and vows. Henry VIII himself broke an empire for the sake of an heir, marrying one wife after another, desperate to preserve his line. Yet ironically, his own lineage would end in infertility and death. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, remained childless, the final Tudor. But perhaps the most haunting example of royal inbreeding came centuries later, far from the marble halls of Europe, in the cold palaces of Russia. The Romanovs carried whispers of the same curse. When Tsar Nicholas II married Alexandra of Hesse, they unknowingly brought the blood disease hemophilia into the Russian royal line. Their son Alexei inherited it, a condition that caused his blood not to clot. Even a small bruise could mean death. The irony: hemophilia was known as the royal disease. It spread like wildfire across Europe's monarchies, from Queen Victoria's descendants in England to Spain, Prussia, and Russia. What had once been called pure blood had become a literal poison. Queen Victoria, revered as the grandmother of Europe, unknowingly carried the gene. Her daughters and granddaughters married kings and princes across the continent, spreading the disease through generations of royal children. What began as a desperate attempt to keep power in the family turned into a slow-motion tragedy. By the 19th century, the royal families of Europe were all connected by blood and by curse. There are letters, still preserved, that reveal the horror behind the palace doors. In one, a Spanish queen writes, "Our child bleeds again. We prayed through the night, but the sheets were red by dawn." In another, a Russian duchess describes the endless fear of watching her son fall. He laughed too loudly at dinner, and by morning his leg was swollen like a corpse. These weren't superstitions anymore. They were scientific consequences of generations who played God, the very thing kings and queens once guarded, their divine blood, and had become a curse that consumed their children one by one. But beyond the pain and disease, something even more sinister brewed in these bloodlines: paranoia. If divine blood could rot, could divine right still exist? Kings began to fear their own lineage. Royal doctors were forbidden to speak openly about deformities. Infants born wrong were hidden away, their names erased from records, their bodies buried quietly in night. In the Bavarian court, one midwife was executed after whispering that a royal newborn looked not of this world. In France, rumors spread of a secret chamber where malformed infants were taken, never to be seen again. Behind golden doors, screams were muffled by prayer. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe's most powerful houses were haunted not by enemies, but by themselves. The blood they had guarded for centuries had turned against them. What began as divine ambition had ended as biological collapse. The portraits that hang in royal galleries today, pale, elongated, expressionless, are not just art. They are evidence, silent witnesses to the sins of inheritance. Each brushstroke conceals generations of whispered vows, forbidden love, and genetic decay. And if you look closely into their painted eyes, you'll see it. The weight of centuries pressing down on a single truth. The greatest curse of kings was not the crown they wore, but the blood that bound them. Beneath the gold ceilings of Europe's royal palaces, another world existed, one of whispers, locked doors, and buried secrets. It was the world of the hidden children, royal heirs who were never meant to be seen. The official portraits showed perfection, glowing cheeks, noble features, the divine grace of God's chosen. But the truth, hidden behind thick velvet curtains and guarded by silence, was much darker, because not every royal child was born perfect. Some were born wrong, misshapen, silent, fragile, cursed, and for a monarchy built on divine perfection, such children could not be allowed to exist. At least, not publicly. The belief that kings were chosen by God meant every royal birth carried cosmic weight. A deformed prince was not just a tragedy, it was an omen, a divine punishment, a sign of God's anger. In courts from London to Vienna, the arrival of a flawed child sparked terror. Priests were summoned before doctors, exorcisms before medicine, and mothers, those queens draped in jewels, were told never to speak of their children again. History has tried to erase them. But faint traces remain, letters, diaries, and fragments of court gossip that escaped royal censorship. And those fragments reveal the unbearable truth. Europe's greatest families were haunted not just by war or politics, but by the monsters of their own making. Let us begin with France. In the glittering court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, rumors whispered of a twin brother, a boy born minutes apart from the future king, yet mysteriously vanished. Some claimed he was disfigured. Others said his birth was an ill omen. But one legend persisted, that he was hidden away in an iron mask, his existence a secret known only to a few trusted guards. Voltaire himself would later immortalize this tale as the man in the iron mask. While historians debate its accuracy, the truth behind the story is undeniable. France had a history of erasing royal children who threatened its image. Centuries later, across the Channel, England's royal bloodlines hid their own shadows. During the reign of George III, a madness descended upon the king, his descendants, too bore whispers of instability and deformity. But far more disturbing were the lost heirs that followed. Hidden behind the grandeur of Buckingham Palace were royal infants who never appeared in records. One such case was that of Prince Octavius, one of George III's 15 children, who died mysteriously at the age of 4. The official record claimed smallpox, but letters from palace staff hinted at something stranger: seizures, violent tremors, and unnatural changes before death. The disease of the blood, perhaps. The same one that had cursed the European royals for generations. But nowhere were the hidden children more tragic than in the frozen halls of Imperial Russia. The Romanov dynasty, desperate to preserve the illusion of divine rule, concealed their darkest family secret behind walls of ice and prayer. When Tsarevich Alexei, the only son of Nicholas II, was born, joy erupted across Russia. But soon his parents discovered the truth. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, the incurable royal disease. Every bruise could kill him. Every fall could be his last. The heir to one of the most powerful empires in history was, in truth, a fragile child held together by silence and hope. To keep his condition secret, the palace became a cage. Alexei was hidden from the public eye, guarded day and night by loyal attendants. When he bled, even the walls seemed to tremble. His mother, Tsarina Alexandra, turned to mystics and holy men for salvation, the most infamous of whom was Grigory Rasputin. The mad monk, it was said, could ease the boy's pain through prayer alone. But his growing influence over the royal family spread like wildfire, feeding rumors of witchcraft and scandal. In trying to protect her son, Alexandra had doomed her dynasty. Yet the Romanovs were only one thread in this vast web of concealed suffering. Across Europe, royal physicians kept silent ledgers, hidden records of children born unfit for the throne. One report from the Habsburg court describes an infant prince, without sound, without sight and without recognition of light. The child was baptized in secret, and dead by morning. In Prussia, a young princess was said to have been locked away in a remote monastery, her existence known only to a handful of nuns. The reason? She was touched by madness, and in Spain a royal infant born with fused limbs was officially declared stillborn, even though midwives swore they heard it cry. The burial was conducted before dawn. No record remains. These were not isolated tragedies. They were patterns, evidence of an entire system built on denial. For centuries, royal families treated illness, deformity, and mental instability as threats to power. A king could be cruel, a queen could be vain, but a prince born wrong meant the gods had turned away, so they erased them. Some were buried in unmarked graves. Others were locked away in monasteries, asylums, or distant estates. living ghosts of royal sin. Even as late as the 20th century, Britain's Queen Mother approved the institutionalization of two of her nieces, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, who were born with severe mental disabilities. Official royal records listed them as dead. But they lived, hidden in a grim state hospital, forgotten for decades. When the truth was revealed in the 1980s, the nation was horrified. Even then, the monarchy's instinct was to deny, to conceal, to protect its image above all else. What's chilling is not just the cruelty, but the pattern that persisted across centuries, the fear of imperfection. Royalty believed their power came from divine blood. So when that blood produced something impure, it was not merely a medical problem, it was a crisis of faith. Every hidden child was a reminder that kings were not gods, that beneath the crowns and robes they were only human, fallible, fragile, and corruptible. In the flicker of candlelight, the palaces of Europe may have looked like heaven on earth. But in the echoing silence behind their locked nursery doors, another truth lingered. The price of divine perfection was paid in flesh and blood, often by those who never had a chance to live. And as Europe's royal families continued to breed power and secrecy, the ghosts of those forgotten heirs would haunt them for generations to come, because history may forget their names. But the blood remembers. It begins with a whisper, a royal mutter in the night, a strange laugh echoing through gilded halls, a crown slipping from trembling fingers. For centuries, the rulers of Europe believed they were chosen by God. But what if God had cursed their blood instead? Madness, once seen as divine inspiration, began to reveal its true face, hereditary decay. And in the great palaces of Europe, it crept like a disease of the mind, devouring kings, queens, and entire dynasties from within. This was no ordinary insanity. This was the madness of royal blood. The story begins with King Charles VI of France, known forever as Charles the Mad. At first he was beloved, handsome, intelligent, adored by his people. But one summer day in 1392, everything changed. As he led his men through a forest on horseback, Charles suddenly stopped. His eyes widened. He drew his sword retide and began to attack his own knights. He screamed that demons were chasing him. When the episode ended, he wept over the corpses of his loyal men, unable to understand what he had done. From that day forward, France's king was lost to delusion. He would wander the palace halls claiming he was made of glass, terrified that he would shatter if anyone touched him. He forgot his own name, his own wife, his own children. The kingdom descended into chaos. His madness was not an isolated tragedy. It was inherited, passed like a ghost through generations of inbreeding, resurfacing whenever royal blood mixed with itself again. A century later, the same curse spread like wildfire across Europe, reaching Spain, Austria, and beyond. Nowhere did it manifest more horrifically than in the Habsburg dynasty, the most powerful family in Europe, whose empire spanned continents. But the Habsburgs had one fatal flaw: they married each other. For centuries, uncles wed nieces, cousins married cousins, and the family tree twisted into itself like a snake devouring its own tail. The result? A lineage of deformity and madness that would culminate in one man, King Charles II of Spain. Charles II was the living embodiment of his family's sins. He was born grotesquely deformed, his jaw so malformed he could not chew, his tongue too large to speak properly, his limbs frail and twisted. He drooled constantly, could barely walk, and suffered seizures that left him unconscious for hours. And yet this broken man was the King of Spain, the ruler of a global empire. Worse still, his mind was as fragile as his body. He was haunted by nightmares and visions, convinced he was cursed by witchcraft. Priests surrounded him day and night, performing exorcisms to drive out demons. When Charles died at 38, an autopsy revealed his body was without a single drop of healthy blood. His brain was swollen, his intestines rotted, and his heart twice its normal size, a monster made by royal vanity. With his death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg line ended, consumed by its own madness. But the curse didn't stop there. In England, across the cold marble corridors of Windsor and Kew Palace, another king's mind began to unravel. George III, the man who once ruled the largest empire on earth, began to hear voices. At first, his courtiers thought it was exhaustion. But soon his madness became impossible to hide. He spoke for hours without pause, his words racing into chaos. He shouted at ghosts, talked to trees, and once tried to shake hands with an oak, believing it was the king of Prussia. His attendants restrained him as he screamed that his flesh was burning. His urine turned blue, a strange symptom modern scientists now link to a genetic disorder called porphyria. In the flicker of candlelight, the ruler of Britain had become its prisoner, confined, humiliated, broken. The royal physicians bled him, blistered him, burned his scalp with hot irons, all in the name of treatment. It was agony disguised as medicine. And behind the palace walls, his wife, Queen Charlotte, wept in silence, for her husband was still alive, yet lost forever. From Vienna to London, from Madrid to St. Petersburg, this creeping madness took countless forms: hallucinations, violent outbursts, uncontrollable rage. Some kings thought they were prophets. Some queens claimed to speak to the dead. Others, like Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, became obsessed with alchemy and occult rituals, convinced they could turn lead into gold and resurrect the dead. Rudolph's castle in Prague became a labyrinth of horror. Rooms filled with preserved animals, shrunken heads, and failed experiments. He trusted astrologers over generals, spending fortunes on strange relics, while his empire crumbled around him. His madness destroyed a dynasty and helped plunge Europe into the 30 Years' War. Even those untouched by deformity could not escape the psychological decay that inbreeding bred. Royal bloodlines had become traps, cages of expectation, isolation, and guilt. Every marriage was political, every child a bargaining chip. There was no love, only duty. And in that duty, something inside them broke. Queen Maria I of Portugal was known as Maria the Mad. After witnessing the death of her husband and the execution of her closest advisor, she spiraled into psychosis, screaming through the night. Convinced she was damned, her doctors confined her to her chambers, where she sang hymns to invisible angels until her dying breath. In her madness, she would often whisper a single question, one that echoes through all royal history: what have we done to anger God? It was not God, it was blood. Centuries of pride, incest, and divine arrogance had produced generations of rulers who were as sick in mind as they were in body. Their palaces became asylums, their thrones prisons. The very families that shaped Europe's destiny were collapsing from within, rotting under the weight of their own lineage, and as their crowns gleamed under torchlight, the people began to wonder, if kings were truly chosen by heaven, why did so many of them seem cursed by hell? The age of divine monarchy was fading, but its scars remained, in portraits that tried to hide the truth, in letters sealed away for centuries, and in the silent portraits of rulers whose eyes seemed just a little too empty. The madness of royal blood was not a myth. It was history's cruelest inheritance. And in the next chapter, we descend to the final layer of this darkness, where the bloodlines ended, the secrets unraveled, and the thrones themselves turned to ash, because this is not just a story of power. It's a story of the death of divine blood. There comes a moment in every empire's story when even the divine must bleed. For centuries, the kings and queens of Europe wrapped themselves in silk, gold, and the illusion of immortality. Their crowns gleamed under candlelight, their portraits painted them as gods among men. But behind the velvet curtains, the truth festered, blood tainted by pride, bodies broken by inheritance, and minds consumed by madness. And when the world finally saw what centuries of inbreeding and corruption had done, it didn't just turn away. It rebelled. It began in France. The year was 1789. Paris was starving while the royal family feasted in gilded halls. King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, had become the living symbols of everything wrong with divine monarchy. Aloof, extravagant, untouchable, but there was something deeper in the hatred the people felt. It wasn't just about food or wealth. It was about blood. The belief that this royal bloodline, once said to be blessed by God, had become a parasite feeding off its own people. When the revolution came, it was swift, bloody, and merciless. The guillotine became the equalizer. One by one, nobles who had ruled for centuries were dragged from their palaces and forced to kneel before the crowd. Louis XVI's head fell into a basket under the roar of thousands. Marie Antoinette's followed. The people didn't just kill their king, they destroyed the idea of divine blood itself. It was the first time in modern history that a nation looked its monarchy in the eye and said, "You are not gods. You are men," but France was only the beginning. Across Europe, the cracks spread like wildfire. The Habsburgs, once untouchable, were dying out. The Spanish crown had fallen into ruin after the grotesque death of Charles II, the deformed, cursed king. Even the Austrian branch of the family, which had once dominated Europe, was rotting from within. By the late 19th century, Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth Sisi of Austria ruled an empire of ghosts. Their children were dead or insane. Their people were revolting. Their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was found dead in his hunting lodge beside his mistress, a suicide pact. Born from despair and madness, the dynasty that had shaped Europe for 500 years was cracking at the core. Meanwhile, in Russia, another royal family was about to face a reckoning that would make history tremble. The Romanovs ruled the largest empire on earth. They claimed divine right from God himself. But like all who believed their blood was sacred, that blood carried a hidden curse. It came in the form of hemophilia, a disease that stops the blood from clotting. The young heir, Alexei Romanov, was born fragile. A single bruise could kill him. Desperate for a cure, his mother, Empress Alexandra, turned to mysticism and faith healers. That's when a man named Grigory Rasputin entered the royal palace, the mad monk whose influence would unravel the empire. Rasputin promised to heal the boy, and when Alexei's condition mysteriously improved after his prayers, the Tsarina became obsessed. Soon Rasputin was making decisions in the royal court, drunkenly boasting of his power over the Tsar and his wife. Rumors spread of orgies, black magic, and whispers that the royal family had sold its soul. By 1917, as World War I bled the nation dry, the people had had enough. The Russian Revolution erupted, and the Romanovs, the so-called divine rulers, were dragged from their palace. In a cold basement in Yekaterinburg, the Tsar, his wife, and their children were lined up before a firing squad. The last of the Russian emperors fell not to war, but to the will of the people. Their blood, once said to be sacred, pooled on the floor like any other. Everywhere across Europe, the pattern repeated. Royal bloodlines that had once shaped continents were collapsing. The Habsburgs dissolved with the fall of Austria-Hungary in 1918. The Ottoman sultans, who ruled for 6 centuries, were exiled from Istanbul after the First World War. The German Kaisers abdicated and fled into obscurity. By the early 20th century, the great age of divine monarchy was over. But it didn't end with a single revolution. It ended because the illusion had been exposed. For too long, royal families had treated their blood as something holy, keeping it pure through incest and isolation. In truth, it had only made them weaker. Their children were born broken, their minds unstable, their empires built on sickness and superstition. When science finally caught up, it revealed what no priest dared say. It wasn't God that punished them. It was genetics. Centuries of intermarriage had concentrated mutations, diseases and psychological instability, and the very attempt to preserve divine blood had doomed it. The empires that once spanned the world had rotted from within, but the fall of the royal bloodlines did not erase their legacy. Walk through the palaces of Europe today, Versailles, Schönbrunn, the Winter Palace, and you can still feel it. The silence in those golden halls is not peace. It's the echo of 1,000 whispered secrets, portraits of kings with pale, lifeless eyes, queens with faint smiles hiding years of torment. The faces that once ruled continents now hang on walls as reminders, not of power but of punishment. They remind us that divine rule was never divine at all. It was human, fragile, corruptible. And when humanity tried to play God, it cursed its own bloodline in return. Today, royal families still exist, trimmed, modernized, rebranded as symbols of tradition rather than divine authority. But behind the smiles and ceremonies, the shadows remain. Because history doesn't forget. It lingers in the family trees, in medical records, in the rumors that still swirl around the palaces. The ghosts of inbred kings and cursed queens still haunt Europe, not as spirits, but as lessons carved into the pages of history. They remind us that power, when worshipped too long, becomes its own disease, and that even the mightiest thrones can crumble, not from outside invasion, but from the poison running through their own veins. So the next time you gaze upon a royal crown, remember what it once meant, not just privilege and power, but the cost of believing one's blood was more sacred than another's. The era of divine monarchy may have ended, but the story of the cursed blood of kings will forever stain the pages of our past, because no matter how many thrones fell, one truth remains unshaken. When humans try to make gods of themselves, they always end up creating monsters.